Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
There's no bigger difference between a curious person and an incurious person. You know, as soon as you meet somebody, as soon as you sit next to them at dinner or at some kind of event, whether or not that person is really kind of genuinely curious about you or about whatever the topic of discussion is. And when, of course, you meet a curious person, it's delight. They tend to be much more pleasurable and interesting, just generally better people. And yet, of course, I don't really understand why anybody... Stephen Fry made this comment a few years ago. Why are people incurious? It seems to be, he says it's the oddest and most foolish failing there is. There's no excuse for it, especially now that we have access to so much fascinating knowledge and information. But it's not just me. It turns out that this divide between the curious and the incurious is an increasingly important one. Highly curious people are in greater demand than ever before in modern economies, and they're pulling away from everyone else. So we're having a lot of debates in this country around inequality at the moment and around the developed world, and we hear a lot about the 1%, but that diverts us slightly from a wider inequality, which is that there's a growing pay gap between the highly educated and the rest in developed economies. So this data is from the US, but similar shift can be observed in the UK and other developed economies. You can see there's a growing gap here. There's a gap between people with a degree, some college education, and no college education, which is the kind of the flat line. But the growing gap is between people with a 4-year degree and the rest. According to Sophie von Stumm, who's a psychologist at Birkbeck, educational achievement is driven by curiosity. So she calls a hungry mind the single best predictor of educational achievement. So curious people are the people who are really kind of driving this trend. And it's not just educational achievement that's driven by curiosity. It's also increasingly success in the workplace after education. And the underlying reason for that is that technology is replacing routine work. So even work that requires a degree of knowledge and intelligence, if it's just routine, then robots are replacing it. And that's what technology replaces first, and it has done throughout history. But increasingly, as we move forward, you'll see smart machines do this more and more, is they're taking over the routine jobs. So curious people, intellectually curious people, people who are capable of learning throughout their career, of asking questions, good questions, of adapting and collaborating with others from different disciplines, people who are capable of really thriving in this world of non-routine work, in other words, are the people that are going to do better. So there's been a lot of debate among psychologists over this for decades, because curiosity is a slightly baffling combination of intellect, emotion, and drive. But the simplest and most profound model of curiosity was created by George Loewenstein, who's a psychologist and a behavioral economist. And he says that curiosity is generated when you face an information gap. When you know something, but you know that you don't know everything. And this makes you want to know more. It's deceptively powerful theory. It's very simple, but it's very powerful. Because what it's saying is that curiosity doesn't exist in a vacuum. You need the bait of information in order to want more. So just to give you a mundane example, let's say I'm talking to you, and let's imagine that you know nothing about opera and a lot about football, or quite a lot about football. And as we're talking, I drop in some intriguing fact about opera. You probably won't be that interested in it because you don't know anything about operas. You've got nothing really to get purchase on. And so you'll wait until the conversation moves on. If I then drop in something intriguing about football, you go, oh, really? Is that true? I didn't know that. Because you had that kind of base of knowledge about football in order to get more interested. If the conversation had stopped after I dropped in the fascinating opera fact, which, by the way, I never do, so you have to worry about that, I might have thought, oh, that's an incurious person. What I didn't understand is that your curiosity depends on what knowledge you have in the first place, and whether or not that therefore creates an information